Hey, everybody, welcome to Lean Whiskey. It is episode 50, the big 5-0. I'm Mark Graban and joined as usual by
Jamie Flinchbaugh. Too bad we can't celebrate a 50th birthday along with a 50th episode, but that's come and gone. So,
yeah, that's in the rearview mirror.
well behind.
Well, I would not well behind, but a year behind, or like
You're closer than me. So,
50.
yeah,
I mean, we're not enjoying a 50-year-old whiskey to celebrate either. We're not
no, we're
we're not
not.
breaking the bank.
Those have gotten expensive. Well,
They
they were, I think, 50
always were.
always were. So 50 episodes. We started this in 2019. And here we are 50 episodes later, and it'll actually be our final lean whiskey.
Well, you
Uh,
jumped right into that. Boy, we didn't brace anybody for that.
no brace, just right here we go. Now,
Well,
to, to make people feel better, it's not our final episode. We're simply going to rebrand the podcast. We're going to keep going. Just won't be called Lean Whiskey anymore. And at the end of the episode, we'll unveil the new branding.
so to be clear, we're going to continue podcasting roughly every 6 to 8 weeks, or that's about how it.
About that, whenever we feel like it, essentially.
Whenever we feel like it, and the schedules line up.
Right.
But yes, we're gonna continue. It's going to have a different name and a slightly different focus, and this is called a teaser in the industry. Not a cliffhanger, but a teaser.
Not a cliffhanger, because we will unveil the brand at the end of the episode. But yeah, essentially, I've been going through some health stuff, and without getting into details, it's a pretty good idea for me to dramatically curtail my alcohol intake. And in the spirit of wanting to live, then
Right.
I should make good decisions, and so I'll be dramatically curtailing my alcohol. I haven't had a drink in a couple of months now, almost, and so didn't seem appropriate to still have lean whiskey. And Mark, who is not going to take the same path I have, was honestly gracious enough to say, "Hey, why don't we just call it something different and keep going?"
Well,
So I'm grateful for that, and looking forward to our continued collaboration.
I'm grateful that we can do that. I haven't had a drink since yesterday, which sounds weird to say that out loud. It's at least, I mean, we're recording this at 7:30 Eastern time. At least I'm not saying like, I haven't had a drink since lunch. But no, I mean, my doctor for different reasons. I mean, I think a lot of people's doctors, or any doctor, would say, hey, sometimes less is better. I was about to say less is more, but being people talk about mindful drinking, and I mean, like a lot of people, I think, people in bourbon will talk about their daily drinker. Well, they might quite literally mean that. And giving the liver a rest, it's a good
Yeah,
idea. Like, I'm going to have a Super Bowl gathering on Sunday. I'll have a couple, but I think, making it more of an event than a habit, I think is good health wise.
yeah, and not just for your liver, for other things as well. And I'm not here to preach. I'd
Mm-hmm.
rather not make this choice. This is not
Yeah.
a morality choice. This is simply
Mm-hmm.
based on where my health is,
Mm-hmm.
and what makes the most sense for me. So uh, to each their own.
Yeah.
But lean whiskey will become something else very, very soon.
And I know, I mean, I've talked to people who come up to me, and the different podcasts I do. This is the one that most frequently someone comes up and says, "Oh, I listened to Lean Whiskey with you and Jamie," and we've always wondered. In fact, we experimented in one episode where we did the whiskey
Mm-hmm.
talk at the end, because we're like, how many people don't care about the whiskey talk? That's not the main reason we were doing that, but it was a theme, it was a hook, something we
Yeah.
were going to enjoy together and talk about each episode, but it could be something else too. And we can still do the lean talk and the leadership talk and everything else that I know we enjoy doing. I enjoy doing it, and
Yep.
hopefully people enjoy listening to.
Yep. And so I think they'll get the same, I was going to say the same flavor. I don't know if that's the right word.
Oh, maybe. No.
The same general feel. I don't think a lot will change for people listening, but if they were dependent on us for whiskey recommendations,
Wow.
then that will be lost. And but in the spirit of headed in that direction, our alcohol selections are non-alcoholic this evening.
Non-alcoholic alcohol.
Non-alcoholic alcohol. So non-alcoholic spirits is, I guess, what they're referred to as. And again, if you don't have to, don't go down this path. You know, it's a choice. But what I'll be drinking tonight is Almave, which is a blue agave spirit,
Right.
non-alcoholic.
So
Uh,
it's an agave, a tequila alternative.
it's a tequila alternative, and the reason I thought I'd try this is essentially Lewis Hamilton is behind it. I generally hate celebrity alcohols, right, or
He's
celebrity spirits.
Formula One driver,
Formula
right?
One legend,
Legend. Okay.
now with Ferrari. I think I have that right, but he's I followed him enough that he's very, very thoughtful in the endorsements he took on. And this was not an endorsement; this was his company. But the projects he does, the work that he does, whether it's in fashion or in even watches, he's very, very thoughtful, very high quality. He doesn't just throw his name around. And so my thought was, well, then he's going to at least do a quality job with this, and I
Yeah.
thought I'd give it a try. Now, I'm not a real tequila drinker, so that's maybe a limitation. It's good. It's smooth. It has complexity to it.
It doesn't taste like flavored water. I mean, like is like, what's the mouth feel? That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, the mouthfeel thin.
Yeah.
The mouthfeel is thin, and it's got a sweet taste to it, which almost reminds me of cream soda. Not with the pow of a sugar and of course the carbonation, but a little bit of the flavor reminds me of cream soda, which I don't even drink soda. I haven't had a soda in years, but um, yeah, will I buy more? Probably not. But it's worth trying, worth experimenting. I'll get a few other different things and give them a try as well. But that's what I'm drinking today.
Okay. And my apologies to Lewis Hamilton. I almost called him Leonard Hamilton. That's the name of the coach at Florida State who's retiring. He's like 76. I was just reading about that the other day, or he said he's resigning at the end of the year. It sounds like a retirement. But Lewis Hamilton, teaser, if people think we're going to turn this into a sports podcast instead of a whiskey podcast, no, because Jamie and I have very different sports interests. I can't talk about football, association football. I can't talk about car racing. So that's not a common ground for us.
No, and I don't follow basketball, hockey, and I only listen to football talk in my house, but I don't really follow it. And don't particularly enjoy watching it. So yeah, we both enjoy sports, but we have very little conversations about that. So that won't be our new theme.
You enjoy what the Europeans call sport.
Sport, yes.
And I like sports. Yay, sports ball. All right. So I am keeping with the theme today, like the other 49 episodes. And Jamie wasn't on a few and I wasn't on a couple, but it was always, we're going to drink something similar, if not the same thing. So I am drinking, I hesitate to mention the brand because I did not like the way it smelled. So I'm let me hold off on naming names at
Okay.
first. But this is called a bourbon alternative, non-alcoholic. The ingredients are water, sugar, natural flavor, some other stuff, caramel color, which Scotch whiskey quite often has caramel color. It's
Hmm.
flavorless, but makes
Right.
it look dark and aged.
Yep.
It's pretty dark. Um, it's less than 0.5% ABV, but it says here then, and there's flavors of baking spice, vanilla, and a kick of vitamin B12. Like this is 100% of the USA daily recommended vitamin B12.
Yes. Get your vitamins in a glass. Not
So
exactly the selling point I was expecting.
yeah, I mean, I guess it's better than not. I'm probably not overloading myself on vitamin B12 during the day. But then this company, and look, this has been a trend. I mean, the party source across the street from me here, America's largest liquor store, they say had 6 or 7 different bourbon, whiskey, malt alternatives. This is a growing market, like not, maybe not as much as non-alcoholic beer
Right.
has been a growing market, but they also produce a sweet vermouth alternative. So what I've made here is a mock Hatton, I guess a mock Manhattan. It's got some splashes of bitters, which small amount bitters have a little bit of alcohol. So that this is not
Yeah.
zero
No,
percent
but you're putting
alcohol.
it's a dash, right?
It's
And it's
a
not
couple dashes.
80. You're not 120 proof or either. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think you can throw in some bitters and you're okay.
yeah, but man, this isn't smelling good. Like I'm just going to be honest. Um, the whole package here is a cocktail. I do have a cocktail, a nice cocktail cherry in there, the fish out at some point. So here, I'm going to take a sip. I hope I don't. I'm going to not spit it. Worst case, not spit it on my microphone or my computer. But like, I want to have an alternative beverage that I like. I don't. I might have to try non-alcoholic beer, even though I'm not a beer drinker. I mean, but
Yeah, yeah, and I don't drink beer. Um, Tom Holland has a new one, so called Beero, but that does not seem to be your cup of whiskey.
oh, for those watching on, there's going to be some screen captures. Don't meme me. Don't meme me. That does not taste good.
Well, that's too bad. It's nice to have an alternative, but I guess that's not it.
That's not
Um,
it. And I was hoping the whole like make it into a cocktail would, because the pseudo non-alcoholic vermouth is made from grapes, which vermouth is a fortified wine, so that's made from grapes. No,
but I do
I'm
wonder.
drinking. I'm going to drink water.
Okay, feel free to go pour some actual whiskey if you.
Well,
If, but I do kind of wonder if the whole mocktail thing is really best for the bar. You're out with friends, you don't drink, they're drinking, you feel included, you're spending more time talking than you are paying attention to your drink, and just from an ambiance standpoint, you feel you don't even notice that it doesn't taste as good.
I mean, it looks like a cocktail.
It looks like a cocktail,
I
right?
mean, my other go to. I mean, if I want to look sociable and not drink, is just club soda with a lime. It looks like a
Mhm.
gin and tonic.
Yep.
I
Yes, it
would
does.
I would rather drink that than than this. And look, there was a range there of gin alternatives, coffee liqueur alternative. There was a dry vermouth alternative.
Vermouth seems hard. That's a very particular taste that seems like it'd be hard to hard to match. I'd imagine gin would be easier, and of course, I don't even know if they bother with vodka because what's the point? But
Right.
just put water in at that point.
Uh,
So
well, I mean, yeah, I'd be curious, like a mock tequila with lime juice and some agave syrup. My,
mhm.
I, yeah, okay, I'm ready to move on.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair
uh,
enough. See you with a new glass at some point when you
no,
on
no,
the way.
I'm gonna take a night off from the bourbon tonight. So we're gonna lean into the talk
Lean into the talk. So
here, and we're going to talk about whiskey sales dropping quite a bit the last 2 years. It's not because people have fallen in love with bourbon alternative spirit,
definitely.
non-alcoholic. But people, a lot of reasons, right? People are drinking less. But before we talk about that decline, we saw an article across the river from me in Ohio, which Ohio is one of the state liquor control board, kind of states. A very regulated market. I think everyone probably has to sell at like MSRP retail price, where in Kentucky prices may vary. So that makes the highly allocated stuff maybe harder to find, because if it's on the shelf at regular retail price instead of a 3x markup, it's going to go. And we know reselling, flipping, the secondary market has been huge in the last decade, a sign of bourbon's popularity. But there was a bill. It's not quite a law. We can go back to Schoolhouse Rock and how a
Mouse
bill.
Rock. Yep.
It's just a bill, poor little bill. Ohio bill would require the highly allocated liquor bottles to be opened at the store. So if somebody were to find, let's say, a George T. Stagg at retail price and want to buy it and flip it for 5 to 10x the price on the secondary market, being forced to crack that seal really pretty much destroys the secondary value of that bottle, because then like you don't know if it's been refilled, and it creates all kinds of trust or safety risk
Right.
issues, right? So what do you think about that idea? Is that the right solution to what might be a problem?
I don't know if it's the right solution, but I don't hate it because it is you see a lot of people hoarding this stuff either just to brag, like, oh,
Yeah,
I've got all these stags, or to resell at a markup, and they go and they stand in line, and they're there early in the morning, and they know which day to show up which places, and so people that just want to buy a bottle just
yeah,
can't. Um, and it's not wine. So if you crack a bottle open, as long as you're not exposing it to direct sunlight or heat, it's going to last just as long as if you didn't crack it. It really, I
yeah,
mean, all the evidence shows that cracking the seal won't affect it. Now, if it's a little bit, if you start drinking it and it gets down to the bottom, that's
yeah.
that's one thing. But if you crack it open and then stick it in your closet, don't come
Right,
back to it for 3 years. No big deal. It's
right.
still fine. So you're basically finding a way to uh, curtail the hoarding in the secondary market, um, which is part of what led to overbuying and things like that, and overpricing, um,
Well,
and chase. So I don't, I would say this. Uh, I think when you try to find a law that prevents the bad behavior, then they'll just find another angle to get to that bad behavior. Um, but again, I don't hate it because I think there's a chance it could work fairly well.
Yeah. I mean, I don't hate the law because I don't participate in the secondary market in either direction.
Right.
Um, Part of me says, well, hey, free markets are free markets. But I mean, technically, like I believe individual to individual liquor sales are not legal anyway.
Anyway.
Um, it's similar to ticket reselling for concerts or sporting events.
Hmm.
I mean, the market is what the market is. If someone's willing, the Super Bowl is coming up on Sunday. What's the cheapest secondary market ticket? Some years it's couple $1,000s, I think, right? So part of me is like, well, people are going to pay that. They're going to pay it. Why doesn't the NFL charge more? Why doesn't Taylor Swift charge more? Why doesn't Buffalo Trace charge more? Maybe they don't want to be the bad guy.
They
You know,
don't, but at the same time, it's the arbiters who are making a big chunk of the money because they're buying tickets and then reselling, right? And that's why you saw scalping, back in the paper tickets, no scalping outside stadiums, and if you didn't buy the ticket with the intent, if you bought the ticket with the intent to go and then want to, can't and want to resell it, that's different than
yeah,
buying just to resell it at a markup. But it's, short of blockchain technology, it's hard to control that. And again, in the whiskey side, this is a way to essentially cut off that ability to resell.
yeah. And this is again for like that rare tier of like the Buffalo Trace antique collection or Pappy bottles, or like it's a drop in the barrel of whiskey volume
Correct.
that's sold. It may have some upward pressure where others go to raise pricing, but it's almost marketing. Like, why doesn't Buffalo Trace just charge more? I think they get um, so much cachet and marketing benefit from the hype and the stories about the secondary market and all of that.
They do, and same time, I'm not sure it's worth more than their
Yeah,
MSRP.
yeah,
I think the hype is poorly placed around Buffalo Trace. But yeah, if your product is that sought after, it's nice to know that you can sell everything you make and that people will stand in line for it, and that's kind of what happens at the Buffalo Trace Distillery.
yeah. Now, the one I think interesting complaint or pushback about that bill is the use case where somebody wants to, let's say, I wanted to buy you a bottle, or buy your boss a bottle, and like, so buying a nice bottle and with the intent of gifting it, and now the seal's been cracked. Some people are fussing about that, but I think you can also explain, like, hey, look, this is the law now, we had to crack it open, and if you're giving it as a gift to someone, they're going to trust that you haven't poured it out and refilled it with this
Right.
fake bourbon spirit alternative thing.
And if you're giving it to somebody else in Ohio, they know the law too. So
Yeah,
and there's plenty of really good stuff you don't need to crack the seal on. So pick a different gift.
sure.
So yeah, I think it's the fact that it had to happen, the fact that even a legislature dealt with it, um, I think is a sign of overhype in the market, right? So
Yeah.
I think the market got overheated. So you always look for these signs of what indicates that the market's gone too far.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that the legislature decided to even take up this issue is, to me, such a sign. Just like when there were like 8 shows about poker
Yeah.
on television at the same time, or there were 12 different shows about custom motorcycle builds all on at the same time in 2007, signs that it had gone too far.
Yeah. I think one of those other signs was emails. Actually, I did a brief phone call with somebody because I was curious about it. Being offered an admittedly speculative investment in a bourbon barrel bourbon barrel futures or actual bourbon, like as a investment vehicle. And what we're going to be talking about now from these other news stories, probably good that I didn't do that.
Yeah, very. I was going to say, there's going to be a bunch of people losing a lot of money on these, especially the way they were structured, because they were built on the idea that the price and the market will continue to go up.
Yeah, sounds like the housing market back in a certain point of like, oh, home values couldn't possibly go down.
Oh, why would that ever happen?
So the
And here
bourbon
we are.
boom coincidentally started after the housing bubble ended. So I don't know how much that was credited to Mad Men or people drowning sorrows or what have you. But bourbon sales, whiskey sales in the U.S. Doubled from 2009. I'm going to make sure bourbon sales. One of the articles we're citing here, bourbon sales had doubled from 2009 to 2023. So I don't know, 14 years of what percent annual growth leads to a doubling. We could do that math.
Yeah, but we're not going to do it live,
No.
on the air.
But I mean, 2009, I was coincidentally, I did a consulting project in Louisville, and I had been a Scotch drinker. And because I was there in Louisville and staying in a downtown hotel, and I started drinking bourbon, and I realized I enjoyed bourbon. So I think I was in right at the beginning of what people say was, the early days of that boom.
Yeah, certainly, and I was probably a little later than that. Again, I was the same thing. I was a Scotch drinker, Scotch wine, beer, and then entered into bourbon. And what we're talking about is not just bourbon, right? That's the bourbon
Mm-hmm.
number, but the problem that's happening today applies to all spirit categories, but in particular applies to whiskey, including Scotch.
Right. So we've got two articles, and there'll be links in the show notes. Let's read the headlines. They're similar articles, a slightly different flavor to them. One was from the Wall Street Journal. Headline: America's bourbon boom is over. Now the hangover is here. And the subheadline says, after years of rising sales, distillers are contending with waning demand and a glut of supply. And then there was another similar article from a publication, newwinereview.com. A whiskey glut isn't coming, it's here. Subheadline: We're staring down the barrel of a whiskey crash, what this means and how it'll play out. Now, that article also pointed out that wine and beer sales have also been down the last 2 years.
Right. So it's different than, we could talk about some of these numbers, but it's different than the 1980s whiskey fall off, which was dramatic. It was I believe bourbon sales or American whiskey dropped by 50% from its peak in the late 70s. But fundamentally, people were switching to gin and vodka and rum, and so that was a shift in the market from one spirit to a different spirit, where this is a reduction of alcohol consumption in general. Although we should separate consumption from acquisition,
Sales,
right?
yes.
From sales, especially in the whiskey market, because of, as we were talking about, hoarding. And I mean, I wasn't hoarding, but my bottles are open. But I have lots of different bottles, right? And they'll last a while.
Right.
Did I need to buy all of them, or could I finish one and then buy a new one?
Yeah.
So certainly people gathered whiskey faster than they were drinking it. So drinking consumption is likely down, as it shows in these other categories.
Yeah.
But also made more dramatic in whiskey in the sense that you could collect, hoard, gather at a faster clip.
Yeah.
Than you could.
Right. So you think about stages of the value stream, and Jamie and I were both reminded of something with MIT origins. So we'll proudly claim association with that. The MIT beer game. We'll talk about that in more detail. But when you think of the stages of at some point the farmers are growing grain and they're selling grain to a distiller who's then in a relatively short time fermenting it and then distilling it. They don't hold the fermented distiller's beer, but they distill it. And so it comes off the stills and then it goes into barrels for years, minimum 2 years, usually minimum 4 years. Then it goes to distributors or wholesalers. Then it goes to retailers. Then it goes to the end buyer, whether that's the bar or somebody at home. And then there could be a delay before it's consumed. So you have all, these inventory holding points. And yes, end consumption by the consumer is different than the variation in production as seen at the retailers, by the wholesalers, by the distillers. So like one thing I wanted to say, we're talking about a crash. I mean, it was like a 4% decrease in sales year on year, right? So somebody in one of the articles said it's more of a slide than a crash. But everyone thinks, oh, COVID times, like 2020 sales were up, I think 7%. 2018 was like an 8% increase. So it looked like it was this compounded 6% per year increase, and now we see a 4% decrease. It's not 50% of the market falling out.
At least not yet. Which it's not like this is done. But I think if you look at it a different way, if everyone in that system was behaving as if 8% year over year growth is occurring, and then there's a 4% drop, you're talking about 12% swing.
Sure.
Right. And that's certainly what we were seeing, is the investment in everything from specialty grains being grown for farm to barrel or to bottle, or new distilleries going up, or new rickhouses going up, or new brands being launched. The investment rate in bourbon and whiskey and even in scotch really suggested that 8% year over year is what we're going to see for a while.
Yeah.
And so if you're investing for multiple years forward looking at 8% or even 5%, but instead we get a 4% drop, that changes everything.
Sure. The other thing that makes it so difficult in the bourbon or whiskey business is the time delays. And one lesson from the beer game is that time delays really make forecasting and fulfillment decisions so much more challenging, exponentially more challenging. So like there's, people realize there's shortages. We're selling everything we make. We can't make enough. It could take a couple of years to bring a new still online because Vendome, one of the main makers of stills, had huge demand and waiting time. It didn't take years to build the still, but you do construction, you wait. And then some of these companies, I'm sure, like finally got their still online, and now they're like, oh, now the market's falling and we wish we hadn't bought that capacity. Or they got the still 2 years ago and they filled a warehouse with new make spirit, and now they might be saying, oh, well, we either wish we hadn't made that much, or, I mean, here's the one variable they have: we can hold it in the barrels and wait to bottle it. So that's, to a point, value-added activity.
Right, which could lead to stronger, premium sales, but not, not at the same volume. Right, that's the risk.
Because you lose that angel share.
Right. You will the angel share, and then, if only certain people are going to spend the money for a 20-year bourbon, you can't make up the volume. You can't take all this volume of 4-year and say you're going to sell it at that premium. And
later as a 6-year or an 8-year, or which should sell at a higher price.
you ended up with a lot of 15 and 20-year-old barrels, which then went places. But you also saw a combination of people dumping it down the drain,
Mhm.
literally, and selling it to lower grade, mixing it and selling it for cheap
And
as well.
yeah, and I think there, unless you're, do I have this right? Unless you're a bonded warehouse, bottled in bond, bonded warehouse situation, you're paying tax on it every year that you're holding it, I think, which
I
is
would
another
I would
variable.
think, yeah.
So do you
I,
bottle it and can you find someone to buy it, or do you hold it and wait and see? So like, is this a momentary blip, or or is it going to keep? Is that rate of decreasing sales going to accelerate from -1% or 2% in 23 to -4% in 2024? Does that accelerate to where no one is 2025 going to be down 10 or down 15? But I would hate to be, I feel sorry for Vendome or the barrel producers. Like you see, this is a global problem. Cooperages and distilleries in Scotland doing layoffs.
mhm.
Because if there's excess capacity, people might not be needing to buy stills. There's going to be secondhand stills on the market because craft distillers are going out of business in some cases.
Yep. And so yeah, the cascade effect is lots of places, and of course in past waves, sometimes it's only in certain parts of the world, and so you can just export more. But in this case, it looks like a global trend. It's certainly affecting a lot of different markets, um, and
I'd be
so
curious about the global trend because these articles really were about U.S. sales.
mostly about U.S. sales, and of
We're a
course all
huge
different
market.
types of whiskey. But and other than the premium side of American whiskey and bourbon, our export market has never been that strong. I
Mhm.
mean, yeah, getting premium bourbon in Japan or throughout Europe, absolutely a strong market. But for the volume, right, to your point around cooperage and and stills and brick houses and barrels, I mean, the volume is not in the premium tier. The volume is in the base tiers, right?
Right.
The 15 to 40 to $50
Yep.
bottles. That, I mean, it's a wide swath, but I mean, we're not talking about the $150 bottles. We're talking about the base of the pyramid here.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, yeah, back to the question of a global problem. This new wine review article has links to other articles about other segments. So the Scotch Whisky Association, so sales are falling. Volume terms, Scotch was down 10.2%. I won't go through the numbers for all these, but the summary article said Irish whiskey is struggling. Canadian whiskey has been sinking for years. Japanese whiskey seems to be doing okay, as it says, quote unquote. But when I was in Japan in November, I forget if I probably did talk about this last time. Yamazaki was available.
Right, which I think is its own. We weren't talking about it then, but it went from unavailable to available, and that's not a sign of a glut, but it is perhaps a sign of a change, whether that's on supply or demand or both.
Softening demand, because yeah, 5 years ago you saw big signs that said we have no Yamazaki. Now they had it, and it was what I would call triple retail price. So I wasn't interested in buying that. But you see signs of softening. Buffalo Trace famously, put a ton of capacity online maybe 2 years ago. When their new still went online, and when I did the recent tour, I mean, there was a huge capacity expansion, and then the risk and the question is, did they over expand? And here's that damn beer game effect, where you're
Right.
chasing the decisions you're making don't come to fruition for 4 to 7 years, and nobody has a crystal ball about where the market's going to be.
Right. And the amount of overshoot on one side leads to the amount of undershoot on the other side.
Mhm.
Right? So why don't we talk about the beer game since we've alluded to it a few times?
Right. And it applies to whiskey.
And it applies to whiskey, right? And it's really was just a supply chain game developed. I think it was developed by John Sturman, but
The
Professor
system
Sturman,
dynamics team. Yeah, I think it was Sturman.
yeah, the system dynamics at MIT, and I taught it for over 15 years. Actually, about 20. I actually facilitated the beer
Mhm.
game. I made my own enhancements to it, both in the teaching, the debriefing side of it, but also running it. A lot of visual management and all of that. So I've led thousands of people, maybe through the
Mhm.
beer game over the years. And so, just for those who haven't been through it, the might as well paint a picture of the mechanics of the game. So, on one end is a deck of cards that represents the consumer, and we'll come back to that because as we get into the dynamics. And then the retailer is the next position, and they have some inventory, and they read a card that says what the consumer wants, and they sell that beer, and then they order some, and they order it from the wholesaler, and it takes a little delay till they get some, and the wholesaler gets the order from the retailer and fills it, and they place an order with the distributor. The distributor fills the wholesaler order, places an order with the factory, and then the factory has to schedule their production of beer. And so there's weeks of delay in information flow. There's weeks of delay in getting the beer you want. And anytime there's a shortage, you may be expecting 10 cases of beer and you got two. And what do you do then? Do you order 20 just to send a message like, hey, catch up, right?
Right.
And so what's fascinating about playing the game, so here's kind of how it works is we generally put in a 50% shockwave, right? So orders go, is what we would do, orders go from 4 to 8 from the consumer. So it's significant, or that's 100% actually. So I think that's what we did, but it's been a while since I ran it. And put this little shockwave into the system. But the magnitude
Mhm.
of what would happen further in the supply chain was massive.
Further upstream, and that's sometimes called the bullwhip effect, because you think of
Right.
the shape of a bullwhip, it gets bigger as it's further back.
So a little shake of the wrist,
Yeah.
right, just a few inches, and you end up with
Yeah.
feet of carry at the end of the bullwhip. And that's kind of what would happen. You'd have this 4 case increase at the consumer, and we'd see 100 case swing at the brewery.
And that's because the brewery doesn't have visibility to the actual end consumer demand. They're guessing
Right.
based on what the distributor is ordering.
Yep, they're separated in time and space. They have uh, physical delays built in. They have information delays built in. They have incentives that are localized versus system wide. And the most important activity in the entire process is left to human emotion, and that's what decision to make about ordering.
Yeah.
And so you see panic, right? You see FOMO. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be short. I better order a lot so I get
Yeah.
ahead of this thing. And we saw that with new distilleries. Nobody wanted to be left out of the surge in bourbon sales. And then you see overreaction on the downside. And will we see, if this trend continues, will we see unnecessary closures and dumping of
Mm-hmm.
whiskey? Because this stuff will never carry its value. We'll have to wait and see. It depends on whether some of the lessons of the beer game are learned.
Yeah. And, anymore, with electronic communication, I would bet the distillers or Vendome are getting these numbers on how much consumer sales are changing. But I think the biggest problem that we don't have when we run the classic MIT beer game is that the time delays are years instead of days or weeks. And so, the lessons we learned from system dynamics in general is just, I mean, like it's. I think there's a connection to lean where when you can compress the supply chain and reduce lead times, it's easier to produce to demand.
And I think an important aspect is structure the flow of information, right? And again, you remove adding human intervention at too many points, right? You may not remove it entirely, but if you have it at all these different points, you have one person that's panicking one way, another person's panicking another way, another person thinks they're steady as she goes, but on either side of them, people are panicking, so their strategy fails too, even if they're calm and collected.
Yeah.
And so structuring the information flow and decision making, I think, is just as much an important part of that design as the flows themselves.
And you see the beer game dynamics in different industries with the long lead times. Commercial aviation is always used as an example. The percent change in passenger miles flown might be very small, but then as you go back and cascading to airlines buying and leasing planes and engines, and then the producers of those engines have backlog, or producers of the aircraft have backlogs and these time delays, and that's where you end up with boom and bust cycles that far exceed the variation year to year in air traffic actual miles. Now with COVID, when there was a huge drop, once in a century kind of situation, people could go park planes in the desert,
right,
as one countermeasure. But semiconductors, right? I mean, it takes a long time and a lot of money to bring more capacity online, more so than a bourbon still.
Yeah, a little bit more. Tens of billions of dollars. What's interesting is, any individual acting in their own self-interest is kind of quite likely to make the situation worse, anywhere they are in that system. The best way, besides making a better system with transparency and tightly coupled information, essentially is to really coordinate across the supply chain. But in certain markets, it's also to coordinate across the market, which of course is illegal. We talk about collusion, and if you go back and read history, business history, not always the most exciting history for people, but if you go read the robber baron era, J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and some of these folks, who are building monopolies, a lot of times people assume they were just evil intended people, but one of their arguments was, this is how we prevent overbuild and underbuild and big swings, and because we can coordinate the market.
Right.
And they're right. It's just, it came at a cost.
Well, and if you don't overbuild and overhire, and then you can avoid layoffs, and there are a lot of headlines about layoffs in Kentucky and Scotland, scaling back production, scaling back shifts. And, these articles talk about the shift from, there were previous years where people were, not the distillery, but people were working 80-hour weeks, and workers were going on strike or threatening it because of being overworked and burned out, just to keep up. And it's, for the most part, that's hopefully people who were making a lot of money on overtime were socking it aside for a rainy day, because I think everyone knows when there's a boom, a bust will come. It's just you don't know when.
You just don't know when, and any individual distillery, it's in their best interest to chase that demand, right? And that's where, if all the distilleries agreed, hey, we're not going to work overtime, whatever it is, right? Then, okay, we'll suppress supply as a result, and we won't overshoot. But again, combinations of illegal and very impossible to coordinate. Then it's a cartel,
Yeah.
and so any one distillery has a self motivation to chase it. Um, and so again, that goes back to FOMO, individual. If I'm a manager, if I'm owner, um, do I fear missing out, and do I overly aggressively go after that market? Or do I say, no, I'm going to steadily increase production, try not to overshoot, one increment at a time. I will lose some at the top end, but I'll also reduce the pain of
Yeah.
overshooting when I have to drop.
Yeah. The Wall Street Journal article didn't mention the beer game effect, but they talked about how wholesalers are drawing down stockpiles they amassed to protect against supply disruptions. So some of that could have been kind of, COVID supply chain concerns. I don't know if that was as big of a problem in distilling. I'm sure people got COVID and had to miss work, but I don't think it was going to. A lot of this is very automated. Farming wouldn't have been affected, but I know a distiller who, this was pre-COVID. There was a year where the beer game effect almost caused a huge. They didn't. I mean, they survived it, but it was a huge crisis where bourbon sales for that brand were increasing for the end customer. And they literally had a calendar year and they're only allowed to sell through distributors other than the handful of visitors who come to the distillery. For the entire calendar year, they had 0 sales to their distributor because the supply chain was full. The distributors had bought a lot. It wasn't flowing through to the end customer. And so the wholesaler said, we don't need any more. And that distillery was cranking up production because they knew sales were rising, but they were caught in that lag where, that's the type of thing that, would put some businesses out of business, whether it's
Right.
in distilling or otherwise, when you get caught in that conundrum. Thankfully, they survived it. And that same distillery is actually seen increasing sales the last 2 years, thankfully, kind of bucking the trend in the industry. So it goes to show averages can be misleading. The Wall Street Journal article said, some distilleries aren't doing contract distilling for others. That the demand isn't there, but Bardstown is still selling everything they can make, but they are a high quality producer.
And that's usually what happens is a combination of quality and good balanced management decision making is how you survive such a downturn, right? And so there will be survivors, there will be victims, um, and and uh, and there'll be some, in the whiskey drop off in the 80s. 22 Scotch distilleries closed in a period of years. Um, our friend David Meyer with Glens Creek is housed in the Old Crow Distillery, which they just shut down.
Yeah.
They shut down. They sold the brand. They didn't sell the distillery. They just shut down, sold the brand and the inventory to Jim Beam,
Right.
and the whole thing was reformulated. So Old Crow, as it was known, ceased to exist based on the 1980s crash. Again, the brand survived, but even the Scotch distilleries, there's a lot of distillery names that are, they're 200 years old, but they were out of production for 50 years.
Yeah.
And people are resurrecting the name or have resurrected the name. So the brand doesn't have to die, but doesn't mean the company and the inventory and the employees, of course, suffer in the glut.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think a lot of the big famous brands that are often a lot of people's favorites, they are huge companies in their own right, like Brown-Forman. Now, Brown-Forman has announced layoffs. and cutbacks, but they've got deep pockets to ride out tough times, or at least in the short term. A lot of brands are, owned by, well, they're all pretty diversified conglomerates. Even Brown-Forman has non-whiskey brands, Diageo and companies like that. They've learned, like, you don't want to be a pure play whiskey company if you're going to be a conglomerate. You're also going to be selling gin and vodka and wine and beer. But if liquor sales across all categories are declining, I mean, people, I'm not one to try to blame everything on the new generation, but they say young adults today are not drinking as much as previous generations for health reasons, and some of this is probably a long-term trend.
Yeah, and risk reasons, and DUI reasons, right? We hosted a graduation party last year, and ended up with a lot of leftover alcohol because the college graduates were not really drinking at this party. It is a different mindset and different attitude um, uh, coming through, and it's not a bad one. Just affecting the market. And so I think I think what you said, it'll affect the employees of those big companies because they'll get laid off, but the companies will survive. Their inventory will survive. They'll probably do some really interesting things down the road as a result. The smaller distilleries, my guess is 80% of them could close. I think the really, really good ones that have a loyal following, like Glens Creek, those will continue to do perfectly fine. It might be hard, but again, make high quality products. People will still want it. But your kind of local distillery that you go to only because it's there, and it's $70 a bottle, even though it's probably worth 15. Those, I can't imagine many of those will survive.
Right. I want to throw a couple other numbers out there from the Wall Street Journal article. They quoted Ken Lewis, who co-founded New Riff Distillery, which is also right across the street here, basically in the parking lot of the Party Source, because Ken Lewis used to own the Party Source and had to sell it when he started New Riff. Party Source, by the way, now is an employee-owned company. Just always to me nice to hear about. But Ken Lewis was quoted as saying there's consensus that they've overproduced in the industry, that they're making 3x what they're selling. So that's not sustainable. But there's some other numbers here that Kentucky bourbon producers, which I think is still 90% of U.S. production, you can make bourbon anywhere. That dispel that myth that it can only be made in Kentucky. But Kentucky produced in 2023 3.2 million barrels. That at the beginning of 2024 they had 14.3 million barrels aging. And like we think, I'm going to pull up Little's Law here. Like those numbers make sense. That whiskey is aging on average 4.5 years. Like those numbers line up. It only lines up if they're actually selling through, if their sales pull through on that. So I did some rough math. 14.3 million barrels is approximately 2 billion bottles, if you assume a yield of like 150 bottles per barrel. So 2 billion bottles in inventory. I looked up U.S. sales were about 50 million bottles a year. So that 2 billion bottles at that rate is like 36 years worth of bourbon.
It's pretty simple math that there's a problem, right?
Yeah.
And
I think my math's correct. It's not, if it's faulty, it's just fault. It's not due to alcohol.
No, it's not due to alcohol.
I'm still kind of really thrown off by this mocktail, so maybe I'm not thinking clearly, but
it is, regardless, even if there's some heck, even if you're off by a decimal point, it's definitely defines that there's a problem there, um, and their decision making and reflects that, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're shutting down things, laying people off, cutting off planned expansions. Um, they are all, almost all, many of them are making the prudent decisions based on knowing what's coming.
Yeah.
And I assume every one of them is probably maxing out their line of credit. This is what I would be doing if I were on their board. Max out your line of credit, put the cash, hang on to the cash, um, get your cash reserves healthy so you can ride this out,
Mm-hmm.
and seek alternative plans for as much of that inventory as possible, while you age the rest of it. So
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see the fallout.
Mm-hmm.
Let's hope it's not as massive as the 1980s drop off, and the carnage that caused in the industry. It really took quite a while to build back quality production. I don't think quality will be suffering. I think in the end, that's the part that's going to win.
Mm-hmm.
But carnage is already here, just in certain corners and certain aspects, and to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see how bad the glut gets.
Yeah. And maybe let's just kind of wrap this segment up. There was, I thought, some interesting writing in the new wine review article. This is a direct quote. Are there enough bars, retailers, and livers left in America to absorb the gargantuan amount of inexpensive American whiskey that is about to be thrust upon a market that is already bloated, saturated, and showing signs of buyer fatigue?
One heck of a sentence.
Yes, that was all one sentence. You're right. So,
But I think it sums it up well. So it's a great way to wrap up. But the math isn't mathing on that equation that they just laid out in that question. So we'll see the consequences, and we'll pay attention to the trend.
Yeah.
See what happens.
So we are going to see a 100% drop off in the amount of bourbon consumed during this podcast as
Correct.
it continues.
Yep, as it continues. We'll probably continue with episode 51, even though the brand will change, and no reason to go back to counting one. And since we like the format and we like our beverages, regardless of what they are, our new podcast will be called Lean Coffee Talk.
Lean Coffee Talk. Yes.
Lean Coffee Talk. So, it'll continue to be casual. We'll continue to have beverages. We may not talk about coffee at the same amount of depth or passion, perhaps, as we did whiskey. Mm-hmm. We'll still talk about it. We are both, I was going to say connoisseurs, but coffee snobs might be more accurate.
Aficionados.
We enjoy quality product when it comes to our coffee.
Yeah, and when it comes to process, I mean, I can think of at least 8 different ways I could make coffee here. 2 different types of machines: French press, cold brew coffee, AeroPress, drip, pour over, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, maybe we'll dig into coffee process a little bit.
Yeah, I was just trying to dial in a new bag of beans for my espresso maker this morning. So, I think we will talk about some process. Again, maybe not at the same volume we talked about whiskey, but we'll have a coffee beverage. Keep it casual, talk shop about lean, and continue with some of the same same spirit in which we've carried this podcast, but without the spirit.
Yeah, you keep saying spirit.
I keep saying spirit. So you don't need to, if you do follow us, thank you, first of all. And you don't need to do anything. You'll keep getting it. Just see a different logo show up, a different name show up. If you don't follow us, well, follow us now, and you'll get Lean Coffee Talk when we release episode 51, or also known as episode 1 of Lean Coffee Talk.
Yep. So it'll be the same feed. So if you're subscribed, you'll still be subscribed. New name, new logo. Don't be tripped up by that. But I think a lot of the topics and the conversation about lean and the news and different things will continue to be part of the soon-to-be Lean Coffee Talk. So yeah, there was Lean Coffee. There's homage to that discussion format. And then, I think Lean Coffee Talk also pays tribute a bit to the show Car Talk, which has MIT connections with the brothers Tom and Ray Magliazzi, they were both, by the way, my commencement speakers at MIT in 1999, which was not a hugely popular choice considering the last 2 years had been Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and President Bill Clinton. I think people who got the Car Talk guys felt a little screwed, but they were fun.
Well, my undergraduate commencement speaker was Dr. Joyce Brothers, so don't complain. You did fine with them.
Yeah.
So we don't talk about MIT a whole lot, but yeah, that's nice to have that sort of connection with the Car Talk ideas and the MIT brothers doing that. And so as we wrap up here, I almost hate to do this to you since you hate your beverage. I was going to do one last final cheers to wrap up an episode, but I'm not sure you want to.
For the sake of doing a toast, I'll let you riff for a second. I'm going to pour a little splash of bourbon for us to toast with.
So, I don't know how we'll end Lean Coffee Talk. We might be too jittery at the end of an episode to do anything with any flair. Although I don't know how many espressos I can drink in a single episode. But we will do one last final 50th episode.
Before we do that, though, we may have to reconsider if we're going to be drinking coffee. We'll have to find a morning time slot that works for recording, maybe.
Yeah, we won't be recording at 9:00 at night anymore with an espresso in hand. That's not good for me. So now that you poured something more your taste, a final cheers, and see you on Lean Coffee Talk.
Cheers, Jamie.